Hello?
Hi.
Welcome back to our studio for another Dev Brief episode. Today, it's dedicated to the topic of the physical model of the plane, in Il-2 Korea, or as it's also known, the flight model. And with us is the person who probably knows the most about it. Why? Because he is our lead flight engineer, Roman Kovalenko. Roma, hi. Glad to have you here in our little studio. Well, tell us a bit about yourself, how you joined our team, what's your background, and so on.
Yes. Well, how I joined, in some ways, it was almost predictable. I went to the Moscow Aviation Institute in the mid-2000s to study flight dynamics and control systems. This is the same department that specializes in simulators, specifically the physics of flight, how a plane flies and its elements. I graduated from this department in 2011. By that time, I had already started working at Mikoyan Design Bureau during my last years at the Institute. I worked at Mikoyan for a few years, and it so happened that while still a student, I began communicating with the chief engineer of the team, Andrei Petrovich Solomikin, on forums. This communication eventually led to an offer to work on simulators, something I was extremely happy about since I have been passionate about simulators from a young age. Starting from the Sega console that I had back then, and then the computer. All sorts. Jane's World War II fighters, Flanker 1.5, IL-2, the old one of course, and many, many more. My first simulator? Sega F-22. The first proper simulator, Flanker 1.5.
What? You didn't play the F-117 Nighthawk even before that? Well, all right. And now, you've risen to the head of the department that's developing the aircraft physics model. How many people are you overseeing? With you, it's already 7.
Now we're 7. And the business is growing because we started actually with about 3, I think. Yes, we had 3 people, then a 4th joined us. But he left pretty quickly.
Let's get back to the topic. It includes many questions, so I'll take the red folder and use it to help myself. Let's start with this thesis. The flight model in Korea is an evolution, not a revolution. Yes, that's right.
The point is that the flight model to be used in the Korea project has origins that go back to the physical model from the days of our First World War sim, Rise of Flight, which was our first project, of course. When Rise of Flight came out back in 2009, at that time, so to speak, I got to see it towards the end of its life cycle, but I also saw how it looked at the beginning. Over the life of the simulator, the flight model has gradually developed. The working principles have evolved, the tools have evolved, and some details have been refined, although the essence of the physical model remains the same. But it evolves. And if we compare Rise of Flight and Great Battles at its inception was very similar to Rise of Flight. Only some adjustments were made then. The model of an aircraft started to be divided into components a bit differently. We call them aerodynamic elements. Adjustments were made to the method of calculating these aerodynamic elements. But overall, it was practically the same. Great Battles took a long time to develop. During this time, we managed to introduce new principles, began to approach the processing of certain variables differently, taking into account some factors. The development of Great Battles is slowly coming to an end, and Korea is starting. Similarly, in Korea, we have started to divide the aircraft into parts again, more meticulously, and taking into account the experience already gained in Great Battles. We have devised some new parameters that we can consider in the physics of the aircraft. Basically, it's still called Advanced Flight Model, but now it has lots of new parameters, additions, a refined approach, and of course, a bunch of experience and knowledge on how to do it. Because when you have nearly 100 airplanes, you can't just do some things in a new way without making changes to those 100 planes. When you start from scratch, you have the opportunity to plan everything in advance, which is actually what's happening now.
The only clarification I want to make about the development is that, actually, we are still developing content for Great Battles at this moment. We are in full swing developing a new DLC, which is supposed to focus on events around Odessa in 41 to 44, and if we're lucky, around Leningrad in 41 to 44. There will be 8 aircraft. A dev blog will be published with all the details. So, in short, the development of technology in Great Battles has now reached a certain limit of possibilities, and this limit is due to the baggage of old content, which cannot be remade. We discussed this in detail with Albert in the earlier issue of our dev brief, and now, accordingly, when talking about technology, yes, it's technology that we are pushing first in Korea. Let's move on to the next section, so to speak. Everything is formal today, After all, we are all engineers. That's the thesis. Why is the flight model being improved, and why develop it at all if everything was already good in great battles?
Good question. Simulators are interesting things. They have been evolving since their public inception, from the late 1980s when they first appeared on personal computers to the present day. When the first flight simulator came out, everyone was thrilled, thinking it was very cool and good. But time passed, and for some reason, it stopped satisfying people. Let's take an example, the oldest IL-2. From a physics standpoint, the old IL-2 1946 aircraft were actually quite well made. They meet their main specifications: speed, rate of climb, and turn time. There are nuances, of course. Many debates have been had on forums about this. But one way or another, the planes are quite similar to their prototypes. But due to the specifics of physics modeling, there's the well-known term model on rails. Although they meet the specifications, how they maneuver is a different story. There's also a term called short-period motion, which describes how the plane responds to control inputs and how it oscillates. All of this was done in a simplified manner. Then, years later, in great battles, what is called the feel of flight emerged, where the flight model not only meets the aircraft specifications, but also models more deeply and thoroughly the nuances of aircraft control, responses to control surfaces, and critical flight modes, such as stalls and spins. That is, there is progress, plus the airplane's behavior when damaged. Yes, that's also important. Progress is being made. Next, we have Korea projects. Naturally, the same feeling of flight and adequate airplane behavior will be maintained. But we are already starting to delve into nuances. The planes have become faster. The influence of high speeds, the effects of air compression when planes approach the speed of sound, are more pronounced. This has a distinct influence on the airplanes. In great battles, it was taken into account on those same late high-speed planes like the Mustang and P-47, including the effects of dive tuck. Basically, it has been accounted for since the lift force depends on speed and Mach number. All this has been taken into account already. But in Korea, it will be accounted for in more detail because it's more important for these aircraft. We want to dive deeper into the modeling of more interesting control effects that will impact the airplane's handling in certain situations. The behavior of the airplane with control input impulses, when the stick is moved, when the pedals are pressed, in such nuances. That is, there is progress, and maybe in 10 years, someone will be sitting in a similar studio explaining why the next simulator will be even better, more detailed than the previous one. In this current iteration, this process will be practically eternal.
Well, here's to history. Technological development is never-ending. Sometimes people have claimed that a particular car or airplane is the pinnacle of perfection and that it can't get any better. And they were wrong, because technical progress is unstoppable, and the development and evolution of aviation simulators are also part of this technical progress, no matter how you look at it. Next point. It's not really a point, but rather a topic about how our new project envisions a new approach to airplane controllability. The result is more realistic control, a more accurate range of rudders, and at the same time, more sensitive steering. It's a big topic, including how we plan to change self-handling.
It all started with the control stick, you could say. In the beginning, there was a flight stick. The thing is, in a real airplane, the control stick has a large range of motion. Compared to the most common joysticks players have, the range is literally multiple times larger. Also, this control stick is required to apply a lot of force, which could reach dozens of kilograms. 10 or 20 kilograms, these are completely normal figures for the force on the control stick. And the control of the airplane from the pilot's perspective is directly linked to the amount of force he applies to the stick and how far he moves it. Obviously, it's impossible to achieve the same handling with a spring-loaded joystick on top of a table. So it turns out that in reality, a pilot uses a very small range of the control stick to control the airplane's movements. Assuming, let's say, a short joystick movement is about this much, then the stick movement might be quite large, but in reality, the pilot controls the plane using a long flight stick. But the forces can reach kilograms, so a pilot in a real plane doesn't feel like he has to make very small, precise movements to accurately make control inputs. Control in a real plane is harmonious. To achieve this on a short-travel, spring-loaded joystick, we went the way of, let's say, compromise in the previous project Great Battles. So the stability of the planes is slightly overestimated. What does plane stability mean? It's how the plane, from a player's point of view, the more stable the aircraft, the larger the movement needed on the stick to change its trajectory. Consequently, it is easier for a player to control with small, precise joystick movements and light loading. The case has started to change here. First, more devices are appearing, with larger movements on the control sticks. Floor-mounted joysticks, various types of joysticks with extenders and brackets are coming out. Finally, joysticks with proper force feedback are starting to appear. However, these are developments of this year. Yes, but it's kind of finally happening, but we're trying to stay up to date, yes, so we have come to the point where we can reassess our options. The stability margin of planes, and thus the control surface deflections needed to manage the plane, can be moved closer to real values. Thus, plane control will become slightly refined. That is, the required stick movement will be slightly less. Actually, this is a very interesting issue because the data on this topic is not always sufficient. But the data we do have, we compiled into a single array, analyzed and assessed how significant these changes should be. Will there be a significant difference compared to great battles? Well, people who have already had the chance to try out our new airplane, the F-51 Mustang, say that it is generally quite comfortable and pleasantly manageable. Indeed, the range of the stick has decreased. Actually, there are interesting nuances because, if you dig deeper, the efficiency of the controls and the momentary characteristics of the aircraft have slightly changed. Such nuances even include a more detailed consideration of compressibility effects on the stabilizer at higher speeds, which change with speed increase. This aircraft's response to the controls altogether allowed us to make the aircraft more realistic while still maintaining adequate control. This includes the most common desktop joysticks.
At this point, we ensured that both groups of our players, whether they use long control sticks or regular desktop ones, could comfortably control their virtual aircraft. For this, we are introducing an additional set of options. In particular, the first tool we use here is an optional built-in response curve in each aircraft, tuned by an engineer for each specific aircraft. You can customize it yourself, just like you can in great battles, but there will be a preset response curve that a specific engineer working on the plane considers most effective. And the second choice is between two connection principles: how the control device, meaning your hardware, your joystick, and the virtual flight stick in the airplane cockpit, are connected. The new mode Roman is talking about. Our main mode is a direct connection. So you won't have this effect anymore where during acceleration, say, your aircraft is in a dive, the real joystick is in a deflected position, but the cockpit flight stick starts to move slightly to the center. That's just because at high speeds, the plane becomes very sensitive, and to make control easier with a short travel handle, the coefficient of connection between them is decreased, meaning that longer travel distances of the desktop joystick lead to shorter travel distances of the virtual flight stick in the cockpit at high speeds. This behavior will be disabled by default. But optionally, this mode can be turned on, because, of course, for those who use desktop joysticks, this is the most convenient one. In other words, we will not break the game for those who use a classic joystick, yet we will also make the game more attractive, comfortable, and enjoyable for those who use new type joysticks with long handle sticks. Besides, we are planning more work on feedback, that is, specifically, new devices that use feedback on the pedals. This topic will also be worked on. We plan to get a prototype soon and see how it will feel in reality.
Yes, this change, more precisely the addition of direct control links, is something players have been wanting for a long time. I have been waiting for it too, because as it turns out, in a classic plane with an increase in speed, the rudder range is limited, because the strength of the pilot is not sufficient to move the stick and rudder pedals through their full range. At high speeds, the real plane is more sensitive and requires less amount of movement of the flight stick, because the control surfaces become more efficient. So it turns out that by maintaining the full range of the joystick, we were actually reducing the range of the control surfaces. Many call this, as they mention on forums, adaptive control, a built-in assistant. No, it was not a built-in assistant. It was actually an implementation of a real physical effect to maintain the full range of the joystick. With the new direct connection, however much the joystick moves, the control surface moves equally, if possible. If your control surface cannot move further, then there will be a dead zone on the joystick. But for long joysticks, this non-linear reliance on control disappears.
Well, about control, I guess we've talked enough about that already. Let's move on. Accordingly, we also plan to change some things in aerodynamics, specifically the aerodynamics of the fuselage, first and foremost.
Yes, the aerodynamics of the fuselage is an interesting thing. Had to find the source. I was literally running around with joy when I found it. The Yak aircraft was tested in a large full-scale wind tunnel. It was tested in parts, that is, first they tested the entire assembled aircraft. Then they removed the wing, as the Yak's design allows, tested the fuselage with the tail, then removed the tail, tested the fuselage separately, the wing separately, the tail separately. Accordingly, this allowed for more precise force distribution, the fuselage separately, the wing separately, and the tail assembly separately. The design of any aircraft allows its wing to be detached. A saw solves any incompatibilities. But not every aircraft allows it to be reattached afterward. So, in general, we, based on this wonderful report, and also by digging through libraries, found separate tests of some fuselages and axially symmetric bodies, and refined the side forces and side moments. Our plane now matches the side controllability sources and skidding sources better. I can say that the Mustang in Korea, for example, had an increase in side slip when applying rudder. This means that you can move the nose more to the sides with only a slight decrease in lateral force. The speed of the flat turn has decreased slightly. An interesting effect. Compared to great battles, it is interesting, a bit unusual, but everything is according to its own documents.
Not secret ones?
Not secret.
Next up, we're changing the aerodynamics calculation method. For the wing.
Yes, the approach to wing aerodynamics is changing. For me, this is probably one of the most important innovations, and in the future, it will prove itself. What does this mean? Our physical model, as initially mentioned, involves dividing the airplane into separate aerodynamic elements. This aerodynamic element represents a certain area of a part of the aircraft, in this case, the wing. We know the center of this area, we know the area itself. At the center of this area, we can measure the properties of the airflow, the angle of attack, the side slip angle, and the dynamic pressure. Using standard aerodynamic methods, knowing the lift coefficients, drag coefficients, and moment coefficients, we get the forces and moments acting on this element. Then, it remains to divide the entire wing into separate elements. What's the problem here? The more elements there are, the more calculations are required, which increases the load on the computer's processor. On the other hand, the more elements there are, the more detailed the forces acting on the aircraft are, and you end up with additional benefits, like natural aircraft damping, more natural aircraft behavior during stalling, spinning, and so on. In great battles, the division of the aircraft in these elements is more detailed at the wing root, where the force from the propeller acts on the aircraft. This is more important. And closer to the wingtip, the elements were larger, and the forces on them were smaller. Now it is possible to make the entire wing divided into sufficiently thin elements across its span, uniformly. At the same time, thanks to some optimizations, this will not significantly affect performance. And what does this give us? Firstly, it gives us a natural view of the lift distribution along the span. The thing is, with a classic aircraft with a straight wing, for example, a Panther here, the closer to the wingtip, the less the lift force. So ideally, it results in an elliptic dependency. For example, this means that the ailerons are usually less effective than the wing at its root with lesser force. With a swept wing, it's a different situation. There is a slightly different distribution picture of the force. There are nuances, and we will now consider them. It turns out that on average, the force acting on the wing remains the same compared to great battles, like they say in general. The behavior of the plane, as I've mentioned, and its characteristics won't change because of this. But the plane's behavior will become more natural, more lifelike. Plus, these more detailed slices will allow for some interesting local effects to be considered in the future, which we may discuss later. But it's a big step forward.
This, by the way, is a good illustration of why such changes couldn't be made in great battles, because doing this would require completely redoing the aerodynamics of all the planes we have built to date.
Yeah, so we have two Mustangs, one with the old elements and the other with the new. The pitch and roll speed, the lift and G-force are alike, but there are differences in some nuances, and we are about nuances.
We should note that the code of these two Mustangs is really different, meaning you can't take the old one and relatively quickly update it. You have to redo it from scratch. And when you have more than 100 aircraft, this is just not feasible. That's why the new project was required, and why we are developing the Korea project. Additionally, we also have some clarifications we need to make regarding aerodynamics and downwash angles. Yes, that's also a thing. You should first explain what it is.
Sure, when a wing works, it creates lift. The lift force, in addition to this force acting upwards, also creates vortices. These are located at the wingtips, they twist the airflow, and this twisted flow then hits the tail. This flow hits the tail at a certain angle. If we look at planes as a whole, we fly at an angle of attack, for example, 5 degrees. The angle of attack on the wing is 5 degrees, but on the tail, it is smaller because of this very twist in the flow. In computational fluid dynamics, we take it into account in great battles. But now we account for it using more accurate methods, approaching this issue in more detail. By the way, this is also a question of the plane balance, which we talked about earlier. This is also one of the important parts of it, accounting for this phenomenon. By the way, here's a little historical note. A nuance appeared when I was searching for information on this phenomenon. I started with one of those common textbooks, roughly from the 1950s. It has some methodologies, tables for calculations, everything is fine, but it's a bit lacking. I wanted more. I started looking in modern publications. I found some information in TSAGI reports that there are methods, but they are quite peculiar. Anyway, search for the information in the textbooks from the late 1930s. Great, let's go through a textbook from the late 1930s. There are many calculation methods there. They are quite simple, simplified, and primitive. But it says, now a new scientist has appeared who is very good in this field. He has done many interesting experiments, and now he has a methodology. Keep an eye on the news. And it turns out they were talking about the same scientist who wrote the 1950s textbook.
A full circle. So, let's move on to the next moment. This is interesting. This is about controllability. Not control, but controllability. These are slightly different terms. The nonlinearity of forces when deflecting rudders and flaps at large angles.
Yes, what's this about? Look, we have a wing here. The wing has an aileron. We have aerodynamic characteristics like what's called a clean wing, with a fixed rudder, lift coefficients, and drag coefficients, all good. We also know these coefficients with rudder deflection at full angles, like 30 degrees. In great battles, we made, so to speak, a linear interpolation between these values, what the aileron gets at full deflection and at neutral. But in reality, it's a bit more complicated because forces change non-linearly. And if at small angles, around 10 to 15 degrees, this non-linearity can still be ignored, then at deflection angles around 30 degrees or more, it's better not to ignore this anymore because, initially, for example, the lift force is when the aileron starts to move. At the start, the lift changes quite strongly, and as it progresses, this effect is lessened. And with drag, by the way, it is the opposite. There's also such a non-linear law. Generally, this will now be taken into account. This also affects controllability in the longitudinal channel. Again, we return to controllability in the new aircraft balance. This is also taken into account. And this also influenced the more sensitive controls with, by the way, unchanged joystick travel.
So it turns out that at the extreme control angle, the distribution of forces did not change, meaning controllability in this sense, like what roll rate the aircraft can develop, for example, with full aileron deflection, it does not change. However, the sensitivity to slight deviations of the stick from neutral changes considerably, meaning that in real life the airplane should start to develop a higher roll rate with smaller stick inputs, but higher input should yield a smaller increase in roll speed. This factor wasn't taken into account, so basically, a small stick deflection will make the airplane roll a bit faster.
Well, more or less so, although this effect is less noticeable on ailerons, but most noticeable on flaps, which usually deflect at the largest angle on planes. We're still experimenting with this, still fine-tuning, but the picture will change slightly. That is, at small flap angles, the lift will be higher, whereas if extended to larger angles, the drag will increase more with less change in lift. It's an interesting nuance that we are continuously and quietly working on.
Well, by the way, if you look at how it's usually done on aircraft, even on civilian planes, how the flap extension stages are set. Accordingly, the usual finer adjustment of angles at which flaps can be released goes at small angles like, roughly speaking, 5, 10, 15, or 20 degrees, and then it goes in large steps, like 30, 40, accordingly. And that's exactly why. And accordingly, in intermediate positions there will be more precise values, lift forces and drag.
By the way, to account for such effects, we've gathered probably more than 10 different sources on surface deflection, comparing, creating tables, observing how, based on calculations of how different rudders behave at different deflection angles, we made summary tables and studied them, so it's also such an experimental work.
Well, since most of our planes are high-speed jets, especially the second generation like the Sabre and MiG-15, We had to refine the aircraft's behavior at transonic speeds, depending on the lift coefficient at the Mach number?
Yeah, I briefly mentioned this. There's the lift coefficient and also moment coefficients. In great battles, this is already taken into account. Both lift coefficients and moment coefficients depend on the Mach number. Drag too, naturally. But now, since this has become the main flight mode for high-speed aircraft, Mach numbers, as far as I remember, 0.82 to 0.83, are now the standard maximum speed, whereas for the Mustang, I think 0.78 was the limit. This is quite a big difference because compressibility effects start to influence the aircraft suddenly and sharply, and they change sharply with small increases in Mach number. Yes, so, in this particular area, more detailed calculations will need to be taken into account. These effects influence the wing's sweep. Actually, why did the wing become swept at that time? Well, because a swept wing also, roughly speaking, works better at high speeds with compression, especially from the point of view of moments, because straight-wing aircraft had this notorious tuck-under during dives, while swept-wing planes avoided this issue. All this will be considered, and it will be more accurate to model at higher speeds. Also, from the aerodynamic point of view, a swept wing is also known as a sliding wing because it's like a straight-wing aircraft flying with a sort of slip. Naturally, in great battles, wing slip is also processed and accounted for. But there are some nuances that will also detail and evaluate the influence of slip on force coefficients.
Yes, the change in the aviation generation has its specifics. Work is in progress right now on all this, and there are already some preliminary results. I think it will be interesting. There's also this point that not everything we do has an external manifestation. A significant part of our work is dedicated to expanding our capabilities in increasing the efficiency of model development. Let's just say we are enhancing the tools.
I can share a bit more about that. Yes, in fact, it's a massive area of work that is hidden from the players. But it is extremely important. It's essentially a modification of the engine and tools used to work with it. For example, I was saying that our wing now is divided into elements in a more detailed way. This required some changes in the engine itself. Let me give you an example. Suppose we decided to consider something unexpected that no one had accounted for before. For example, the roughness of the airplane's surface. Well then, suppose, from a software point of view, we have functions that calculate the lift force, let's say roughly, for each section of the airplane. And these functions receive the necessary parameters for the calculations. As I was saying, the same attack angles, slip angles, speed, and Mach number. But the set of these parameters is quite limited, because the more extra information you pass, the slower the program works. That's why we always try to optimize. And here we wanted to account for the roughness. We have to somehow integrate this into the program. Option 1. If you have a few planes, you can specify in each function the roughness of the swing, but then we won't be able to change it. So we need to modify the function itself and add an extra parameter. To do this, it's not just the function that needs to be rewritten, which is easy, but also every plane and every calculation method needs to be updated with new parameters. This is difficult and time-consuming and limits possibilities. For instance, in such a case, in Korea we anticipated such situations and built some universal tools that allow us to make calculations more accurately and accommodate new parameters easily without such issues and having to redo everything. This work is not noticeable but very important for the future.
So let's drink to a systematic approach.
We also have built-in simple tools that make it more convenient to work with the code. It reduces the likelihood of errors. Reduce time spent on mechanical work with data arrays, since there are actually a lot of data in the physical model. Without exaggeration, these are huge sheets of data that often appear as just incomprehensible figures. And it's hard sometimes to just process and manipulate all the data. We've also devised some new methods to simplify everything. For the future, for example, we've provided a set of parameters that can describe the local geometry of the wing. As I said, our wing is now divided in more slices. But for now, at the stage of such ideas, there is a desire to move from a sort of generalized wing, as in dynamic work often with the mean chord wing, to local parameters of each wing section. But it's also still at the stage of such experimental ventures. But all this work done now allows us, well, at least to seriously consider this.
And that's cool. Actually, the approach to development has changed a lot, let's say. I mean, some things stayed the same, but many others were previously seen as suboptimal. But we had to accept, due to the sheer volume of existing content, now we are using every opportunity to optimize and improve these areas. On to the next point. How does it read in engineering terms? Extra information is already embedded in the architecture. Basically, this is what we've been talking about. And, well, it's worth mentioning that this isn't the final list.
Of course, the work is ongoing. I don't like to talk about what I want to do, but there aren't any clear plans yet. But I have to say there are some personal wishes that I hope to achieve. It'll be interesting and I will have more to share. Let's say I already have some developments on this topic. I want to implement local stalls. The thing is with the wing, when an airplane reaches high angles of attack, the flow separation on the wing doesn't happen immediately across the entire span. In fact, it happens differently depending on various conditions. The separation might start at the tips and spread inward, or start at the root and slowly spread outward. Now we could try to do it. How could this be useful? Well, for example, if the separation starts to develop at the end, we have ailerons at the end. Loss of aileron effectiveness at large angles of attack is the result. We have this implemented in general. But in this case, it will be implemented more interestingly, because a larger part of the lift force will remain, and control at least will no longer be there.
Well, plus, if we work on the sound at this moment, the moment of the separation will become clearer. An experienced pilot, while controlling the plane, knows these things. Unless the plane is some huge megatransport where you have no idea what's happening 50 meters away at the wingtip, you'll never know that. Yes, accordingly. If it's, well, a sort of variable-sized fighter jet, the pilot can feel with his fingertips or sense what part of the plane is where, how it's behaving. Well, if he's experienced, that's it. And that's something we can try working on, at least through sound. Dear friends, with that, we conclude the first part of this dev brief. We've already decided to split it into 2 parts. Why? Because we've been sitting here for already more than half an hour, talking only about the basics we wanted to share with you. The second part will come out a bit later, where we'll answer the questions you've asked about the airplane flight modeling. Be sure to subscribe to our channel, give this video a like if you enjoyed it, and you can also give it a dislike, though we'll definitely find you. Thanks a lot, Roman. Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.